everyone. I am joined today by my wonderful colleague Nicole. Nicole is our Impact Director here at thinkstep-anz. What is very handy is that in a previous role, when she was working for a large corporate, she was in the sustainability team, which was part of the marketing team. And clarity around any sustainability claims is just so ingrained in Nicole that she's a wonderful person to talk you through some of the topics today. Let's get underway. We'll start with a little bit of terminology, because the greenhouse gases are one thing. They lead to global warming, which is not the same as climate change, but because it's getting warmer, we have climate change. So it's one leading to the other. Increased greenhouse gases have a greenhouse effect that makes it warmer. That leads to climate change. Most of you would already know that. And I'd say in the last 15 years, we've actually learned quite a lot. When PepsiCo, with their Walker's crisps, first came out 15 years ago, putting the carbon footprint of a pack of crisps, they actually did get questions on how can we have 80 grams of carbon in a pack of 35.5 grams of crisps. That doesn't compute. It's more carbon than actual crisps. People didn't quite get that this was the carbon footprint. Now I think people would actually get it, but there are other things that people are confused about. They were still confusing, even if we have been able to clarify that question. One thing that we often get is, but they're only talking about carbon, but there are more greenhouse gases. That is correct. But not even only just colloquial, even the ISO standard for carbon neutrality 14068 actually says when we say carbon, we mean all greenhouse gases. It is important though to actually have the little e there, and we'll come to that in a moment. Also something that I hope we wouldn't see anymore, but still occasionally we come across those things. You'll see that this is referencing a CD or DVD, so it is a little bit old, but it's still a really good example to demonstrate of what not to do. A few comments in the chat maybe? Or what's happening here? What should we not be doing? Many people like to think that in the digital age, CO2, is it? CO2? Emissions are lower, yet it takes 5 times as much CO2 to make a CD or a DVD as it takes to make an entire newspaper. Well, I'll share my observations here. First of all, is it a fair comparison? We're not really comparing apples with apples here, because a CD is used completely different to a newspaper. So not a valid comparison. What about the end of life of a CD player and the use phase of it? The CD player needs electricity to run. And of course, we're not talking about carbon monoxide squared. We are talking about carbon dioxide. So it actually does need to be CO2 with a subscript 2. I have seen carbon monoxide squared recently, just a few weeks ago, in an annual report of a company. So it still does happen. The main thing though is also to really cover the full life cycle. We do have to take into account the use phase if we're talking about electronic goods, for example, or the end of life. So that is quite important for any claim, to make sure you cover the full life cycle or you cover all scopes. And to cover all greenhouse gases. What's the difference between this and this? It's nitrogen trifluoride. And quite often you would see still a graph also from an old graph from the Greenhouse Gas Protocol with just the 6 types of gases. That's an immediate giveaway. They're not following the latest standard. It needs to be 7 groups of greenhouse gases. While not many companies would necessarily emit nitrogen trifluoride directly, it is very relevant for the electronics industry. For example, for flat panel display, so if you use a lot of electronic goods, it does become relevant in your supply chain. So 7 groups of greenhouse gases. And because we have so many of those gases, we need the equivalent. So whenever you find somewhere someone's talking about a carbon footprint and they only talk about CO2, in that case, they actually only mean carbon. And we need the equivalent, because some gases, like methane, for example, that's 28 times as potent as carbon. It's important to have all the gases, and the equivalent does demonstrate that you actually are looking at all the gases. Now, something else that we often find is we're carbon positive, we're carbon negative. Well, what is it? Do they cancel each other out? Is being positive actually a good thing? If you do a COVID test and it comes out positive, that's not necessarily a good thing. Carbon negative actually does mean you are taking out of the atmosphere more carbon than you put in. And that is a negative net number. Therefore, our strong recommendation is talk about carbon negative, because that's what it actually is. You have a net negative result. You take more out from the atmosphere than you emit. The thing though is there is no universally agreed threshold. It could be 1 ton, it could be 1%, it could be 10%. If you go save, it could be 20%, but there is no actual threshold or standard that says only if you take out X much more, you can call yourself negative. There is no standard around that. That was a little bit of technical detail. Nicole, what's your view? What can actually happen?
Well, there's so much that's going on at the moment. Like, I've just picked out 3 little case study examples just out of the last 3 months of things that are going wrong with corporate communications about carbon. Our first one is about Energy Australia. So Energy Australia, I actually saw this all over LinkedIn to start with. So their headline is Energy Australia apologises over claims of greenwashing with Go Neutral products. So they were taken to court over their Go Neutral carbon offset product, and the court found it misleading. And as a result, Energy Australia actually had to make a public statement, which was agreed with the NGO that had taken them to court. The public statement from Energy Australia clearly says offsetting does not prevent or undo harm from carbon emissions, that it is important that you must reduce and do all you can to reduce your emissions before offsetting, that if you're choosing offsets, they should permanently remove carbon from the atmosphere, which is quite a high bar. And they admitted that their and others' carbon neutrality marketing claims can mislead consumers. And so that was the key issue, was that they were misleading residential consumers over their carbon neutral claims. And so the conclusion out of that was that they and everyone else need to provide clear and transparent information to consumers, particularly if you're using offsets, where and how they've been used, and what those offsets can actually achieve in terms of offsetting the emissions that they have been emitting from the company. So quite a scary case that has come out very recently. A couple more. The next one is with Apple. So Apple actually have been advertising an Apple Watch with a lower carbon footprint, and they're now facing a lawsuit over claims for some Apple Watch models that are advertising this. And the issue that they've been taken to court over is that 2 carbon offsetting projects didn't provide genuine reductions in carbon. So one was in Kenya, and it's a conservation project to prevent deforestation. So that sounds good. But when you look below the carpet that's covering it over, that forest has been legally protected since 1983. So offsets sold to protect from deforestation don't achieve anything. So it can't be used to generate the offsets that they're claiming. The second one was in China. And again, it's a forested region, but it was actually already heavily forested before they started replanting. So they weren't actually regenerating at all in that case. And the final example is Adidas. So this one is happening in Europe, in Germany. So they actually lost a lawsuit, and they can no longer advertise climate neutrality plans. So they weren't saying they're climate neutral, they weren't saying they're carbon neutral, they were just advertising plans for it. But the court said what they failed to do was provide concrete steps for how they were going to achieve it beyond 2030. They didn't actually clarify if carbon offsets would be used in achieving it, and they didn't actually provide clear explanations around what climate neutrality is. The court said this is an ambiguous term and we don't understand. So Barbara's going to clear that up very shortly. The court did emphasise that the term climate neutral is ambiguous and they need transparent and credible climate commitments so that they can be tested and proven to be true. Back to you, Barbara. Can you explain this stuff to us?
Well, I'm just going to go right into that. So what does it actually mean? They all sort of sound the same. Is it carbon zero? Is it zero carbon? Is it net carbon zero or carbon neutral? It'll be fair to think they actually all are the same. And some of them are. So carbon zero, zero carbon, they generally mean the same thing. What they also mean is that there are zero emissions. And just that, it's nothing to do with offsets, it's just there are zero emissions. Is that possible for many things, services? Not really, because somewhere in the supply chain there will be some emissions. So to make that claim, you'd have to be very sure there actually are zero emissions. Net carbon zero is a slightly different story. There is a definition that comes from the Science-Based Targets Initiative. You can only call yourself net carbon zero if you have deep emissions reduction and neutralize the remaining emissions with offsets. It cannot just be by offsetting. You have to have deep emissions reduction and a plan for it. And then the remaining can be set off. So that is quite important. And carbon neutral is a term that comes actually out of an ISO standard. There is an ISO standard 14068, which gives a definition of what carbon neutral means. I've got the full ISO definition here, but I'll give you my interpretation of it because that's a little easier to read. It needs to be for a defined subject. It can be your organization, it can be a site, it can be your product or a specific product. It needs to be a time scale. We are carbon neutral now, or we're carbon neutral by whatever time. You do have to have a target for greenhouse gas reductions, and that target needs to be significant. It can't be, we'll reduce our emissions by 3% by 2030. That's not quite ambitious enough. It needs to be aligned with science. You have to have planned means of achieving that reduction. That is exactly the example that Nicole just shared from Adidas. They did not have that plan, and that did not go well for them. And you have to have an offset strategy for the remaining emissions. And again, you need to be made really clear that the offsets you're choosing are actually credible. Then you can call yourself carbon neutral. So it's quite a few hurdles, but also it actually is very meaningful if you can do it, because that's a real solid statement. Now, does carbon neutral mean the same as climate neutral? No, it doesn't, because as we said before, climate change is actually the final result of what happens. Carbon means we're reducing that greenhouse gas effect, which has an impact on climate. So carbon neutral and climate neutral are not the same thing. There is a definition for climate neutral, and again, I've put the full definition here from the IPCC, that is the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, top scientists from all countries around the world, and our vision of the definition. Climate neutral means, if you say you're climate neutral, it means we're not causing any further impact on our climate by reducing emissions as much as possible. Again, we have to have reduction. By balancing out any leftover emissions by removing an equal amount from the atmosphere. So far, that would be carbon neutral. But also for climate neutral, you go a bit further and consider local effects. If I have a sealed surface versus a forest, well, in summer, if you go into a city, it'll be really much warmer than if you go into a forest. That is because the forest does reflect more of the sunlight back up and therefore leads to less warming. And that has an impact on climate. So local effects impacting on the climate will contribute to climate neutral. Glaciers are a really interesting example because of the greenhouse gas effect. We have less of them. We have less white surfaces on the globe, but white surfaces really reflect sunlight very well. So it's a double whammy to have less glaciers because they also have an impact on climate. They're not just suffering from it. So there's quite a bit of language to get right. Otherwise, you do run a risk of getting into greenwashing in risky claims.
Absolutely. So let's just talk quickly about what greenwashing is. Greenwashing is making misleading or false claims about environmental or sustainability impacts or benefits. It's not only what you say, but it's also what you don't say. So omitting information can amount to a false, misleading, or deceptive communication, depending on the circumstances and overall impression created. A business is considered to be engaging in greenwashing where they use any claim that makes a product or service look better or less harmful to the environment than it really is. So I'm going to play a quick game here of pick the greenwash. So have a quick look at this next slide and have a think to yourself on which out of these do you think might be greenwash? So if we say we are carbon neutral, could that be greenwash? Well, it could be. It's an unclear and unqualified claim. There's no evidence about why they're carbon neutral. There's no statement about making reductions. There's no certification. What about we buy twice as many offsets as the emissions we produce? That sounds good, right? But what kind of offsets? Are they high quality offsets? Are they verified? Are they real? Who's checking them? Are they being cancelled so they're not double counted? So a risk with offsetting is, oh, we've bought offsets and we're using them for this year, but if you use them for this year, then nobody else can use them and they can't be used for next year. And that has to be made sure of. What about we'll be carbon zero in 2050? Well, I think we just saw that with Adidas, right? Where's your plan? Is it realistic? Is it resourced? And we only purchase genuine offsets. That's great. It sounds really good, and maybe it is, but where's the explainer on why it's true? How do they audit? How do they really know those offsets are genuine? So a few top tips on how to avoid greenwash about carbon neutrality. Make sure that all your claims are accurate, clear, true, and material. Make sure that you do have the evidence to back up your claims. If you make a claim, have the scientific independent evidence, independently verified, to make sure it's true. Make sure your future promises are realistic and reasonable and don't hide stuff in the fine print. Avoid making broad statements like the ones that we just looked at. And if you've got challenges, own them and communicate about them. People want transparency. You can find more information in the documents that we've got little pictures of there from the ACCC in Australia and the Commerce Commission in New Zealand. Both have excellent guidance. So one more recommendation. Here you can see a recommendation to acknowledge your challenges and be open about your sustainability plans. And we have an example on the right-hand side of the kind of things that you can say. So you can say, we're working to reduce our emissions by 30% by 2030 and currently offset the remaining carbon footprint through verified carbon offsets or verified carbon credits. I have stolen a few slides out of our greenwashing masterclass just to be transparent. If you're interested in that, there'll be a link in the chat that you can find out more. Just a little bit more on carbon credits and carbon offsets. So carbon credits are earned by projects that store, reduce or avoid greenhouse gas emissions. And in the purple on the left, there are some examples of that. You can buy a carbon credit as a financial instrument to offset your emissions. So they become the carbon offset. I really want to point out is this is a theoretical or a calculated transfer of emissions. I can buy a carbon offset to offset my emissions because somebody else working in agriculture has saved emissions there. But have they? And so the last point on that slide, the integrity of carbon credits is crucial. You need to make sure that they are genuinely happening or you get stuck like Apple has. If not, they may not reduce emissions at all, so beware. And really, the final point that I want to make is this is just a little saying that I say, right? Do your best and then offset the rest. It's just a nice little rhyme, but actually it's incredibly meaningful. Do your best means do everything you can to reduce your emissions and to plan to continue. And if you're doing that, I think that good offsets are a good option for the rest because we're better off doing something positive in offsetting than not doing anything at all, but only when we've done everything we can to reduce our emissions. Now, Barbara, there's a whole bunch of labels out there that you can get for carbon things. How do I know it's real?
The simplest thing is to actually check, do they say they're compliant with the right standard? We find all sorts of things. Following ISO, aligned with ISO, inspired, that is my favorite, inspired by ISO, in line with ISO, those are just not good enough. It needs to be compliant, and with carbon neutral, it needs to be compliant with ISO 14068. For other for product footprint, it needs to be compliant with 14067. If it is your organizational footprint, it needs to be compliant with 14064. So they just don't just follow a line, be inspired, comply with the right ISO standards. That really is the most important thing. Because we get asked so often, can you say this? Can we say that? Can you just have a read through that? We've actually now summarized that for you in a new offering. And that is, we can help you to review your carbon claims. I know we don't often do that in webinars, but this one we get asked so often. We can help you to use the right language to check if you are actually aligned or compliant with the standard, flag the risks for you, help reduce it, and support you with what is the right communication. And what you will get from us is to have a carbon claim reviewed. We'll identify those risks, make some recommendations. We do not recalculate all your carbon footprint as part of this review. That is separate. But we will suggest next steps to actually make solid claims that you can stand by. And if you do want us to do that and you're here in the webinar, you can actually use the code Carbon Clarity and we'll do that for you for under $1,000. If you do want to do it in future or have more claims, then there are additional fees. There will also be a chat to this, link to a chat. But a quick checklist, we will leave you with a quick help yourself checklist for now. If you have a label, have they actually published their requirements? Do they say what standards they comply with? Is there independent third-party verification? For product, is it compliant with 14067? Does it cover all stages of the life cycle of a product? Is it not only we produce it, but what happens down the track is excluded? For an organization, is it compliant with 14067? ASCO 1, 2, and 3 included. For a net zero goal, is it science aligned? Carbon neutrality, is it compliant with 14068? That's your quick checklist and should get you most of the way there. We do have a few questions, so we'll jump straight into those. Kirsten wants to know, I don't understand what you mean about the universally agreed threshold of how much when we talk about carbon positive, negative, we should say. There is no standard that says you have to offset at least 20% more than your footprint is to call yourself carbon negative. You could
Yeah.
do 1% and call yourself negative, but how credible is that? So it's really, so there is no universal threshold for that.
Yeah. And there's some level of doubt given inaccuracies in measurement and all that sort of stuff. If you just fall over the line, is your claim actually even true? So, we know, for example, EPDs, according to standards, are plus or minus 10%. So if you're just falling over the line and you want to make a big claim, that can actually be really dangerous.
Yeah. Kirsten also has another question. We won't be able to get quite to all of them, but for small businesses, certifications are prohibitive. Can they provide their own evidence while they work on getting to the stage? Yes. You just have to be transparent about it, explain what it is that you do. You could get someone to just have a look over it, and you have to be really careful with what your claims are. Just be really careful with what you are claiming to do. If you just do it, if you just do it yourself, totally fine. I would stay clear of saying we are carbon neutral. Those types of claims will require a bit more rigor behind it. But there is certainly really good language you can use if you do it yourself. Even if you say, we just started the journey, you're measuring our footprint. That is what we have done.
Yeah.
We have not yet done all scope 3 emission categories. We started with these two because they're most relevant. Transparency is key, and that gives credibility. No one will say,
Absolutely.
oh, but it's not complete. Just be upfront about it.
Yeah. I certainly wouldn't be making outlandish claims based on only your own calculations, though. So to make statements that you're on the journey, to use a well overused term, and you're working on things and all that sort of stuff. I am aware of quite a few claims in the Australian market, particularly at the moment, about recycled content of products, for example, which are just plain false. And you don't want to acquire that sort of label because you're not sure. It's really hard to access all of the expertise that you need sometimes to be able to be confident in making credible claims. So generally take the conservative approach just so you don't get any exposure there.
I'll take one last question from Amy. Under ISO, is carbon neutral for an operation inclusive of all three scopes? There is one other thing. There aren't actually any mandatory scopes. We hear that quite a lot during the mandatory scope 3 categories. There isn't such a thing. What exists? Material scope 3 emissions. If they're material, as in really significant, you have to include them. And that is the same for an operation. It's not necessarily inclusive of all three scopes. All three scopes, 1, 2, and 3, yes, all three scopes are included. Sorry, I misread your question. And within scope 3, it doesn't have to be all 15 categories because some of them will just purely not be applicable. But it's definitely all three scopes. With that, we're getting more and more questions. Do send them through. We'll get back to you. We are running out of time. Maybe that last one, we're purchasing electricity. The provider has climate active carbon neutral product logo. Does it mean we can be confident that at least the energy we purchase is carbon neutral? Well, you'd need to check the carbon neutral product if that actually complies with the right standards.
So
And then
if it's certified to climate active, it should be. However, climate active is under review at the moment, and it's just important to understand that not all offsets are equal, and that apparently there have been some offsets recognised under climate active that may not be genuinely providing the reductions that they have said. So you could certainly check out what kind of offsets your electricity provider has used, but theoretically, yes, it should be fully carbon neutral, but it is dependent on the type of offset and whether it's a genuine reduction. Okay, well, I think that brings us to a close, Barbara. Sorry, guys, we've run over time a bit because it's such a big topic. The video will be made available on our website over time. We've just got to, cut it and polish it and all those exciting things. Barbara, any last words from you?
no, that's it. Thanks so much for your interest. We will have a look through the chat if there were any remaining questions, and we will get back to you. Check out the quick guideline. It'll be at the end of the webinar once we post it. And if you are unsure, do reach out to us and we can do a review of your carbon claims for you.
We have many more webinar replays on a whole host of sustainability topics. You can check them out on our website and our YouTube channel.